She was a billionaire at breakfast, but by dinner, Victoria Hastings was shivering on a rain-soaked pavement with absolutely nothing. Her empire stolen, her bank accounts frozen, her fiancé vanished. The only hand reaching out to save her belonged to the very janitor she had heartlessly fired just yesterday. At 8:00 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning, Victoria Hastings stood at the pinnacle of the Manhattan skyline, looking down at the city that belonged to her. At 34, she was the sole founder and CEO of Omnicorp Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar supply chain empire that moved everything from medical supplies to consumer electronics across the globe. She was ruthless, brilliant, and untouchable. Her bespoke charcoal suit cost more than what her average employee made in 6 months. "The merger with Kinsley Global is ready for your signature, Victoria," said Richard Sterling, stepping into her sprawling corner office. Richard was not just Omnicorp's chief financial officer, he was Victoria's fiancé. With his perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that could disarm a hostile boardroom, he was the only person she implicitly trusted. "Have the board convened in conference room A," Victoria replied, not turning away from the window. "Once I sign this, Omnicorp essentially monopolizes the Eastern Seaboard. We trim the fat tomorrow. I want a 20% reduction in operational staff by Friday." 20%? Richard raised an eyebrow. "That includes the custodial and maintenance contracts. People like David Miller, the single dad who cleans your floor. You just cut their overtime last week. They are numbers on a spreadsheet, Richard. Profit margins don't care about personal sob stories," she said coldly, finally turning around. "Let's make history." Victoria walked into the boardroom expecting applause. Instead, she was met with a deafening, heavy silence. The 12 members of the board of directors were seated rigidly. At the head of the table, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who distinctly looked like federal agents, sat Richard. "What is this?" Victoria demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "Why are the feds in my boardroom?" Richard stood up, his charming smile replaced by a cold, unfamiliar mask. "Victoria, effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as Chief Executive Officer of Omnicorp Logistics. The board has just voted unanimously for your removal." Victoria let out a short, harsh laugh. "You can't remove me. I own 51% of the voting shares. I am the board." "Not anymore." A gray-haired board member named William spoke up, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Richard brought some irregularities to our attention last night. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, embezzlement of corporate funds to the tune of $400 million, and wire fraud directly tied to your personal signature." Victoria's blood ran cold. "That is an absolute lie. I never authorized any offshore transfers. Richard handles all the financial routing." She looked at her fiancé, expecting him to defend her, but the chilling realization hit her. He had the access. He had her signature. "The evidence is overwhelming, Miss Hastings." One of the federal agents stepped forward, handing her a thick folder. A federal judge signed an injunction at 6:00 a.m. "Your shares are temporarily suspended, pending investigation. Furthermore, all of your personal and corporate assets have been frozen under the RICO Act." "Frozen?" Victoria whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "You can't do that. I built this company from a garage." "I've already assumed the role of interim CEO," Richard said smoothly, walking around the table. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "You were always too busy looking down from the penthouse to see who was digging at the foundation, Victoria. Thanks for the empire." "You bastard," she hissed, raising her hand to slap him. But the 2 agents were immediately on her, grabbing her arms. "Escort Miss Hastings off the premises," Richard commanded, straightening his tie, "and deactivate her credentials." In front of 200 of her own employees, the billionaire CEO was marched to the elevator. She wasn't allowed to return to her office for her purse, her keys, or her coat. The security guard, a man she had never bothered to learn the name of, brutally clipped her ID badge from her lapel. Thrown out onto the bustling sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, Victoria stood in stunned silence. She reached into her pocket. She had her customized corporate smartphone and a single platinum credit card she kept in her phone case. "I'll destroy him," she muttered to herself, her hands shaking with a mix of pure rage and adrenaline. She dialed her high-powered defense attorney. "The number you have dialed is not in service," an automated voice chimed. Omnicorp IT had already wiped and deactivated her corporate phone remotely. The screen went black, rendering the $1,000 device a useless brick of glass and metal. Panic, a completely foreign emotion to Victoria Hastings, began to claw at her throat. She walked briskly to an upscale cafe across the street, seeking a landline. "Excuse me," she told the barista. "I need to use your phone. It's an emergency. I'll buy a black coffee. Just run this." She slapped the platinum card on the counter. The barista swiped it. The machine beeped an angry red. "Declined." "Try it again," Victoria snapped. "Ma'am, it says the account is locked," the barista said, eyeing her defensively. Victoria grabbed the card back and rushed out. She hailed a cab, promising the driver a diamond watch if he got her to her Upper East Side penthouse. She would just grab her emergency cash from the safe, hire a shark of a lawyer, and tear Richard to shreds. But when the cab pulled up to her luxury building, she saw the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers. Federal agents were carrying boxes of her personal belongings out of the lobby. Her home was a crime scene. She ducked behind a parked van, realizing with horrifying clarity that if she walked up there, she would be arrested on the spot. No phone, no money, no home, no friends. She had alienated them all on her ruthless climb to the top. The sky above Manhattan darkened, and a cold, unforgiving autumn rain began to fall. Victoria Hastings, the queen of logistics, was suddenly just another nameless face on the street, entirely unequipped to survive the concrete jungle she had once claimed to own. By 10:00 p.m., the reality of her situation had completely shattered Victoria's pride. She had spent the last 12 hours wandering the streets of New York, getting progressively more soaked and freezing. The bespoke charcoal suit clung to her skin like a layer of ice. Her designer heels, meant only for carpeted boardrooms and chauffeured town cars, had completely blistered her feet, leaving her limping painfully. She had tried to seek refuge in a high-end hotel lobby where she was a regular, but the manager, having already seen the breaking news of Omnicorp's scandalous collapse on the television, coldly asked security to remove her. She was a liability now, a toxic asset. Hunger gnawed at her stomach a sharp, aggressive pain she hadn't felt since her struggling college days. The city that had once bowed to her every whim now felt like a sprawling, hostile labyrinth. Every passing shadow felt like a threat. Every siren sounded like the police coming to arrest her for Richard's crimes. Exhausted, trembling, and utterly defeated, Victoria stumbled down a dark, wet stairwell leading to a subway station in Brooklyn. She huddled into a dark corner near a broken ticket machine, pulling her knees to her chest. The smell of damp, concrete, and stale urine was overpowering, but it was out of the biting wind. She rested her head against the filthy tile wall, and for the first time in 10 years, Victoria Hastings cried. She wept for her stolen life, for the betrayal of the man she thought loved her, and for the sheer, terrifying helplessness that had consumed her in less than 24 hours. "Rough night?" A voice echoed through the empty corridor. Victoria gasped, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. Through the dim, flickering fluorescent light, she saw a man approaching. He was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular, calloused arms. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but sharp, carrying the weight of a man who worked too hard for too little. He stopped the bucket a few feet away, leaning on the wooden handle of his mop. He squinted at her, and Victoria turned her face away, utterly humiliated. "I don't have any money," she croaked, her voice raspy from the cold. "Leave me alone." The man didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, folded white handkerchief, tossing it gently so it landed on her lap. You look like you need that more than I do, Miss Hastings." Victoria froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up, staring into the man's face. There was something familiar about his jawline, the quiet dignity in his posture. "How do you know my name?" she asked defensively. "Are you a reporter? Because I have nothing to say." "I'm not a reporter," the man said, a slight, almost sad smile touching his lips. "My name is David Miller. I was the night shift floor supervisor for the custodial team at Omnicorp. Up until yesterday afternoon anyway, when HR sent out a mass email saying our entire department was terminated without severance to maximize quarterly margins." The memory hit Victoria like a physical blow. David Miller, the name Richard had mentioned just before the boardroom coup. She had dismissed him as a mere number on a spreadsheet. She had effectively destroyed this man's livelihood just hours before her own life was destroyed. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to gloat, to laugh at her poetic downfall, to kick her while she was literally in the gutter. It was exactly what she would have done. "Go ahead," Victoria whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Tell me I deserve this. Tell me karma is real. Call the cops and get the reward." David stared at her in silence. The hollow roar of a subway train echoed in the distance, vibrating through the cold floor. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "I have a 7-year-old daughter named Lily," David said quietly, his voice steady. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago. I work 2 jobs to keep a roof over her head. When I got your termination email yesterday, I didn't know how I was going to pay for her asthma medication this week." Victoria flinched. Every word was a knife of guilt. She had never considered the human cost of her bottom line. She had been too busy looking at the macroeconomics to see the bleeding micro-realities. "I came down here to finish my 2nd shift," David continued, picking up his mop. "I saw the news on the TVs in the break room. I saw what your fiancé did to you. The embezzlement frame job. Then you know I have nothing." Victoria sobbed, her tough exterior entirely broken. "I have no money, no power. I don't even have a coat. I'm nothing." David watched the billionaire tremble on the filthy floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thermos. He unscrewed the cap, poured a steaming cup of coffee, and walked over, kneeling down beside her. He held it out. "Take it. It's hot," he said. Victoria looked at the cup, then up at David's face. There was no malice in his eyes, no vengeance, just a profound human empathy that she couldn't comprehend. With shaking hands, she took the cup. The heat radiating into her frozen palms was the best thing she had ever felt. She took a sip. It was cheap, bitter coffee, but to her, it tasted like absolute salvation. "Why?" Victoria asked, her voice breaking. "Why are you helping me? I ruined your life yesterday." "Because you're freezing, Miss Hastings," David said simply. "And because my daughter taught me that if you see someone falling, you don't step on them. You offer them a hand. Anger won't buy Lily's medicine, and it won't get you out of this subway station." He stood up, pulling a heavy wool flannel jacket from a hook on his supply cart. He draped it over Victoria's shivering shoulders. The jacket smelled of cheap laundry detergent and hard work, and it was incredibly warm. "My shift ends in 10 minutes, David said, looking down at her. "I have a small apartment in Queens. It's not the Upper East Side. The heat rattles, and the couch is lumpy, but it's dry, and it's safe. You can stay the night." Victoria stared at the hand he was offering her. It was rough and scarred. It belonged to a man she had considered entirely invisible. Yet, in the darkest, most terrifying moment of her entire life, it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Swallowing the last remnants of her toxic pride, the billionaire reached up and took the janitor's hand. The morning sun filtered through a crack in the faded yellow blinds, hitting Victoria's face. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding, momentarily disoriented by the harsh clanking of a steam radiator. She wasn't in her silk sheets at the Plaza District penthouse. She was lying on a lumpy, floral-patterned sofa in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens. The events of the previous day crashed down on her. The boardroom coup, Richard's betrayal, the freezing rain, and the janitor who had pulled her from the abyss. She sat up, the heavy wool flannel jacket slipping off her shoulders. From the tiny kitchen, the smell of burnt toast and cheap coffee drifted into the living room. "Morning," David said, stepping out of the kitchen. He was dressed in worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, holding a chipped mug. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes even more pronounced in the daylight. "I didn't want to wake you. I figured you needed the sleep." "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice quiet. It was a phrase she rarely used, and it felt unfamiliar on her tongue. She looked around the apartment. It was painfully small, but impeccably clean. A shelf in the corner was lined with library books and framed photos of a smiling blonde woman, David's late wife. Suddenly, a small figure padded into the room wearing oversized cartoon pajamas. It was a little girl with messy brown hair and big, curious eyes. She clutched a nebulizer mask in one hand and a battered, stuffed bear in the other.
"Daddy, the machine is making that funny noise again,"
the little girl said, her breathing sounding shallow and slightly wheezy. David immediately set his mug down and hurried over to her. "Okay, Lilybug, let's get it fixed. Sit right here." He guided her to a small dining chair and began tinkering with the plastic tubing of the medical device. Victoria watched, paralyzed. She noticed a crumpled receipt on the coffee table from a local CVS pharmacy. It was for a generic albuterol inhaler. Next to it was a past due notice from Con Edison for the electric bill. "The insurance got cut off yesterday at noon," David said quietly, noticing where Victoria's eyes had landed. He didn't say it with malice, just a tired acceptance of his reality. "The pharmacy wouldn't run the copay. It cost $80 out of pocket. That was my grocery budget for the week." Victoria felt a physical knot twist in her stomach. Yesterday, at 8:00 a.m., she had ordered a 20% cut to operational staff to bump Omnicorp's stock price by a fraction of a percent. To her, it was a strategic maneuver to impress the analysts at Goldman Sachs. Here, in this tiny apartment, it meant a little girl was struggling to breathe while her father skipped meals. "I didn't know," Victoria whispered, the guilt suffocating her. "I know you didn't," David replied, turning on the nebulizer. The machine hummed loudly, delivering a steady mist into Lily's mask. "People at the top rarely look down, Miss Hastings. You only see the clouds." Lily looked at Victoria through the clear plastic mask and offered a small, muffled wave. Victoria swallowed hard, forcing a tight, awkward smile in return. "I'm going to get it back," Victoria said suddenly, her voice hardening with a sudden surge of adrenaline. The ruthless CEO who had built an empire from a garage in Brooklyn was beginning to thaw from the ice of yesterday's shock. "Richard Sterling thinks he can steal my life and leave me to rot. He made a fatal error." David raised an eyebrow. "He has the feds, the board, and a $400 million paper trail pointing at you. What do you have?" "I have the architecture of the very system he's using to frame me," Victoria stated, standing up. The blistered heels of her feet ached, but she ignored the pain. "I wrote the original source code for Omnicorp's financial routing matrix. Richard is a brilliant manipulator, but he's not a coder. If he moved that money, he used the legacy backdoor I built 10 years ago to bypass internal audits during our startup phase." "A backdoor?" David asked. "Yes, but I can't access it from a standard terminal. And my biometric access has been wiped." Victoria paced the small room, her mind calculating variables at lightning speed. "I need a burner laptop, a secure VPN, and an employee who still has active intranet credentials inside the Omnicorp building. Someone on the ground." David sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're asking me to help you commit corporate espionage." "I'm asking you to help me expose a criminal," Victoria corrected, looking him dead in the eye. "If Richard finalized that merger with Kinsley Global today, thousands more will lose their jobs. He's going to liquidate the assets, gut the maintenance and warehouse divisions entirely, and golden parachute his way out. If you help me, David, I swear on my life, I will not only restore your job with full back pay, but I will make sure Lily never has to worry about her medical bills again." David looked at his daughter, who was breathing easier now, the mist from the machine dissipating. He looked back at the disgraced billionaire in his living room. He saw the fire in her eyes, a desperate, undeniable conviction. "I don't know any high-level executives," David finally said, "but I know the guys who fix their computers. My buddy, Simon. He's a tier, 2 IT support tech on the 40th floor. He owes me. I covered his shifts when his mother was sick last year." "Call him," Victoria said. "Tell him we need to meet. Off the grid." By 2:00 p.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the streets of New York slick and gray. Victoria and David sat in a dimly lit booth at a rundown diner deep in the Bronx, far away from the polished glass and steel of Omnicorp's Manhattan headquarters. Victoria wore an oversized hoodie David had lent her to hide her face from any passing security cameras. The diner door chimed, and a nervous, lanky man in his late 20s hurried in. He clutched a beat-up messenger bag to his chest, constantly looking over his shoulder. He slid into the booth opposite them. "You're crazy, Davy," Simon hissed, his eyes darting to Victoria. He recognized her instantly, even under the hood. "Miss Hastings? God, the whole building is crawling with FBI and forensic accountants from Deloitte. Richard Sterling is acting like a king. He just fired the entire HR department this morning." "Simon, I need your administrative token," Victoria said, skipping the pleasantries. Her tone was back to the commanding cadence of a CEO. "I need you to ping the internal AWS servers and tunnel me in." "If they catch me doing that, I go to federal prison," Simon protested, his voice cracking. Sterling installed new tracking software on all employee devices at 9:00 a.m. "He installed Sentinel Pro, didn't he?" Victoria asked. Simon nodded, stunned. "It's a bloated software. It has a blind spot on port 8080 during its automated registry update at 3:15 p.m. You have exactly a 3-minute window where it drops its firewall to communicate with the cloud." She slid a cheap, prepaid burner laptop across the table, purchased with the last $80 David had to his name. "You plug your physical USB token into this. I'll do the rest from here." "Simon, Richard is going to offshore the entire IT department to a third-party vendor in India by Friday. You're losing your job anyway. Help me burn him to the ground before he burns you." Simon stared at the laptop, then looked at David. David gave him a slow, reassuring nod. Trembling, Simon reached into his bag, pulled out an encrypted silver thumb drive, and plugged it into the cheap laptop. 3 minutes, Miss Hastings," Simon whispered, looking at his watch, "or we're all going to jail." Victoria's fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, she closed her eyes, centering herself. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was a street fight in the digital realm. She opened her eyes, and her fingers flew across the keys. Lines of green code reflected in her intense gaze as she bypassed the initial security gates using Simon's credentials. She hit the internal Omnicorp firewall. Access denied. He changed the root passwords. Simon panicked. "Passwords are for people," Victoria muttered, typing furiously. "I'm a ghost." She executed a script she had written a decade ago, exploiting a 0-day vulnerability she had purposefully left in the legacy architecture just in case she ever got locked out. The screen blinked. Access granted. She was in. The vast, sprawling financial matrix of her company lay bare before her. She immediately ran a search query for the $400 million that was allegedly embezzled under her name. The FBI had traced it to an account at Credit Suisse in Geneva, authorized by a digital forgery of her signature. "Follow the money, Richard. Where did you move it?" Victoria whispered, scanning the routing numbers. "He wouldn't leave it in Switzerland. It's too hot. The Swiss cooperate with the SEC now." Her eyes caught a discrepancy. A microscopic transaction fee, 32 cents, billed to a secondary shell company registered in Delaware, Sterling Horizon Holdings. "Got you," she hissed. She tracked the IP address that had initiated the transfer from the Swiss account. It didn't come from her office. It came from a luxury penthouse in Tribeca. Richard's personal IP address. Look at the timestamp. David pointed at the screen, leaning in close. He initiated the transfer at 2:00 a.m. on Sunday. Weren't you in London at a logistics conference then? Yes, Victoria said, a triumphant smile breaking across her face. I was on a British Airways flight over the Atlantic without Wi-Fi access. I couldn't have authorized the wire. My passport stamps and flight manifests prove it. But her smile vanished as she opened the active ledger for Sterling Horizon Holdings. Wait, the 400 million is gone, Victoria said, her blood running cold. What do you mean it's gone? Simon asked, clutching his coffee cup like a lifeline. He liquidated it. He converted it into unregulated cryptocurrency Monero and transferred it to a cold wallet, Victoria explained, her voice dropping. But that's not the worst part. She clicked into a drafted contract, sitting in Richard's hidden digital outbox. It was a merger addendum with Kinsley Global. He's not just merging the companies. He's selling OmniCorp's proprietary AI drone routing patents, the crown jewels of my company, to a hostile foreign competitor, Apex Global, for pennies on the dollar. He gets a massive kickback in a non-extradition country. Victoria looked at the date on the contract. He's signing the final transfer tomorrow at the OmniCorp annual shareholder gala. Tomorrow? David asked. Can we take this evidence to the police? The police won't understand a decentralized crypto ledger in time, and the FBI already thinks I'm a flight risk, Victoria said, slamming the laptop shut just as the 3:15 p.m. window closed. If Richard signs those patents away tomorrow night, OmniCorp is dead. 10,000 people lose their jobs instantly, and he gets on a private jet to Dubai, untouchable. Simon grabbed his USB token back, sweating profusely. So what do we do? Victoria looked at David, the man who had picked her up out of the dirt, and then at Simon, the man risking his freedom for her. The ruthless CEO was gone. In her place was a leader who finally understood the value of the people in the trenches. We can't fight him in a courtroom, Victoria said, a dangerous spark returning to her eyes. So, we're going to crash his party. I built OmniCorp. I know its blind spots. I know its security. And I know exactly how to humiliate Richard Sterling in front of the entire financial world. She stood up from the booth, pulling the oversized hoodie tight. David, you used to run the night shift custodial team. You know the service elevators in the loading docks at the Plaza Hotel where the gala is being held, don't you? David smiled slowly. I know doors the Secret Service doesn't even know about. Good, Victoria said. Because tomorrow night, the janitor and the fugitive are going to steal back $1 billion empire. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, glittering diamonds, and the quiet murmur of immense wealth. At the front of the room, flanked by towering floral arrangements and the glowing gold logo of OmniCorp Logistics, stood Richard Sterling. He wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, holding a crystal flute of champagne, basking in the adoration of Wall Street's most ruthless investors. He was minutes away from finalizing the Kinsley Global merger and signing away the proprietary AI drone routing patents to Apex Global. The ink on the digital tablet would secure his golden parachute to Dubai and leave 10,000 OmniCorp employees entirely destitute, far below the glittering chandeliers. In the damp, concrete bowels of the hotel's loading docks, the real world operated. Keep your head down, David whispered, adjusting the collar of his ill-fitting catering uniform. Walk with purpose. The invisible people in this building are only stopped if they look like they don't know what they're doing. Victoria nodded, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was dressed in a starched white shirt, a black vest, and black slacks. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a severe bun. She carried a massive silver tray loaded with unlit sterno cans. Just 48 hours ago, she would have walked through the front doors of this hotel, and the general manager would have personally escorted her to the VIP suite. Now, she was sneaking through a service corridor smelling of bleach and rotting garbage. They bypassed the main security checkpoints entirely. David knew the blind spots of the service elevators, a leftover instinct from a decade of running night shift maintenance crews across Manhattan. He swiped a borrowed proximity card he had procured from an old friend who worked in the plaza's kitchen, and the heavy metal doors slid open. "Mezzanine level," Victoria whispered, as the elevator lurched upward. The primary audiovisual control room sits directly above the ballroom stage. It controls the LED backdrops and the master PA system. If I can get my burner laptop hardwired into their primary server, I can override the presentation. "And if there's someone in the booth?" David asked, his jaw set. "Then we improvise," Victoria replied, the ruthless fire of the CEO returning to her eyes. The elevator pinged softly. They stepped out into a darkened, carpeted hallway overlooking the ballroom. Through the heavy velvet curtains, Victoria could hear Richard's smooth, practiced voice echoing over the speakers. "And so, as we look to the future, we must trim the heavy branches so the tree may thrive," Richard was saying to the crowd, prompting a round of polite, greedy applause. "The acquisition by Apex Global of our legacy routing divisions is not a loss, it is a vital evolution." "Liar!" Victoria hissed under her breath. They reached the door labeled AV Control, authorized personnel only. David gently pushed the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the room was bathed in the blue glow of dozens of monitors. A single technician was sitting in a rolling chair, wearing heavy headphones, entirely engrossed in a game on his phone, while the gala's automated presentation ran itself. David didn't hesitate. He stepped into the room, deliberately knocking his elbow against a metal utility rack. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The technician ripped off his headphones, spinning around. "Hey, what the hell are you doing in here?" "Oh man, I am so sorry," David said, adopting a look of sheer panicked incompetence. "Catering sent me up with the sternos for the buffet, but I think I got turned around at the service bank. Are you the guy who ordered the vegan platter?" As the technician stood up, aggressively ushering David out into the hallway to point him toward the kitchen, Victoria slipped from the shadows and ducked under the massive mixing console. She pulled the burner laptop from her waistband. Her hands flew across the cables, locating the HDMI and Ethernet inputs for the master projection feed. She plugged the laptop in, opened the terminal, and executed the script she had finalized in the diner. Down in the ballroom, Richard Sterling smiled, turning to the Apex Global representatives seated at the front table. "And now, I will sign the digital transfer of our routing architecture." An aide handed him a sleek silver stylus. Richard held it up for the cameras, waiting for the flashes to pop. He lowered the pen to the tablet. Before the tip could touch the glass, a deafening screech of audio feedback ripped through the ballroom. The crystal glasses on the tables vibrated. Several attendees cried out, covering their ears. On the stage, the glowing gold Omnicorp logo flickered, violently glitched, and suddenly vanished. In its place, a massive, stark white document appeared on the 50-foot LED screen. It was a live feed of the Monero cryptocurrency ledger. Next to it was the drafted hidden contract, detailing a $400 million kickback from Apex Global to a shell company called Sterling Horizon Holdings. The ballroom fell into a dead, stunned silence. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his charm instantly evaporating. He pointed a shaking finger at the AV booth. "Cut the feed! Cut it now!" "You always were too busy looking at the applause to see who was holding the microphone, Richard." A sharp, familiar voice boomed through the master PA system. The crowd gasped. Federal agents, who were attending the gala in plain clothes to monitor the controversial transition, suddenly stood up, their hands moving toward their earpieces. On the balcony overlooking the stage, the velvet curtains parted. Victoria Hastings stood there, looking down at the man who had stolen her life. She wasn't wearing a designer gown. She was wearing a catering uniform, but she commanded the room with the absolute authority of an empress. The $400 million missing from Omnicorp wasn't embezzled by me, Victoria's voice echoed through the massive room. It was moved through a legacy back door by Richard Sterling. He initiated the transfer from his Tribeca penthouse at 2:00 a.m. on Sunday. I have just broadcasted his personal IP logs, his flight manifests, and the encrypted Swiss routing numbers to the SEC, the FBI, And every journalist in this room. Richard's face drained of all color. "She's lying! She's a fugitive! Arrest her!" he screamed, dropping the stylus. "I'm not finished," Victoria said coldly. She tapped a key on her laptop. The screen behind Richard shifted. It showed the smart contract architecture of the Monero cold wallet, where the funds were held. Richard thought crypto was untraceable. He's right. But he didn't realize that the transfer protocol he used was built on my proprietary OmniCorp code with a failsafe. Victoria hit the enter key one final time. On the massive screen, the $400 million balance in Richard's hidden account instantly drained to zero. "I just triggered a forced clawback," Victoria announced, her voice dripping with venom. "The funds have been permanently locked into a federal escrow account. You have nothing, Richard. No money, no Dubai, and no company." Chaos erupted. The Apex Global representatives scrambled away from the table, desperately trying to distance themselves. The FBI agents rushed the stage. Richard tried to bolt toward the side exit, but two heavily armed agents tackled him into a table of champagne flutes, shattering the glass in a spectacular crash. Victoria watched him get pulled to his feet, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. She felt a profound, heavy silence wash over her. The empire was hers again. But as she turned around, looking at David, who was leaning against the doorframe of the AV room, watching her with a quiet, proud smile, she realized the empire was no longer what mattered. 1 week later, the rain was falling again in Manhattan, but inside the OmniCorp penthouse office, it was warm and bright. The federal injunction had been entirely lifted. Richard Sterling was facing 40 years in federal prison for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and racketeering. Victoria Hastings sat behind her massive mahogany desk. She was wearing her charcoal suit, but the icy demeanor that had once defined her was gone. The door opened, and David walked in. He was no longer wearing a faded blue jumpsuit. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. "You wanted to see me, Miss Hastings?" David asked, looking slightly uncomfortable in the expensive clothes. "Sit down, David," Victoria said, smiling genuinely. "And please, call me Victoria." David sat in the leather chair opposite her. "I spent the weekend reviewing the operational budgets," Victoria said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "I've fired the entire board of directors who colluded with Richard. We are restructuring. But more importantly, I am reinstating the entire maintenance and custodial division with full back pay plus a 20% hazard bonus for the sudden termination." David stared at the folder, his eyes widening. "Victoria, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she replied softly. "I also instituted a new comprehensive healthcare policy for all OmniCorp employees, top to bottom. It covers all specialty medications, entirely out of pocket. Lily will never have to wait for her nebulizer treatments again." David swallowed hard, the emotion clearly catching in his throat. "Thank you, truly." "Don't thank me yet." Victoria leaned forward, folding her hands. "Because I don't want you cleaning floors anymore. David, I need a new vice president of facilities and employee operations. I need someone who actually sees the people at the bottom of the ladder, because the CEO was too blind to look down." She slid a silver pen across the desk, right next to the contract. "The salary is high, the hours are long, but the coffee is significantly better than the Subway," Victoria said, her eyes shining with tears. "What do you say?" David looked at the pen, then up at the billionaire whose life he had saved with a single cup of cheap coffee. He picked up the pen. "I say," David smiled, clicking the pen open. "Let's get to work." And that is how a brutal fall from grace taught a ruthless billionaire that human compassion is the ultimate currency. Victoria didn't just win her empire back, she gained a heart, and David finally got the life his daughter deserved. If this story proved that kindness always wins, smash that like button. Share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more incredible stories.